When an atheist professor publicly mocked God in front of Barron Trump, he thought it would be an easy victory. What he got instead was complete humiliation. But before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It all happened at one of those prestigious academic conferences where America's brightest young minds gather, the kind of event where professors love to flaunt their intellectual superiority and progressive ideals. Among the attendees was Barron Trump, who had earned his place there through academic excellence, though many whispered that he was only there because of his last name. Professor Richard Anderson was known throughout academic circles for his sharp wit and even sharper tongue. A self-proclaimed champion of modern thinking, he had made quite a name for himself by ridiculing traditional values, particularly Christian beliefs. His lectures weren't just classes, they were performances where faith became the punchline, and God was the joke. As students filed into the grand lecture hall that morning, there was already a buzz in the air. Professor Anderson's reputation preceded him, and everyone knew that his lectures were more like intellectual gladiator matches. What they didn't know was that today's match would have an unexpected champion. The professor began his lecture, with his usual flair, pacing the front of the room like a predator sizing up its prey. His topic: leaving antiquated beliefs behind and embracing modern rationality. His eyes scanned the room, landing briefly on Barron, a slight smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Little did he know, he was about to face the most challenging and humbling experience of his academic career. "Let's address the elephant in the room," Professor Anderson declared, folding his arms across his chest. "Studies consistently show an inverse correlation between intelligence and religious belief. In simpler terms, for those who might need it," he smirked, looking directly at Barron, "the smarter you are, the less likely you are to believe in supernatural fantasies." Several students shifted uncomfortably as Professor Anderson pulled up a graph on the screen. "See this declining line? This is what happens to religious belief as IQ and education levels rise. Fascinating, isn't it? Though I suppose some people's family traditions," another pointed look at Barron, "make it harder for them to accept basic cognitive development." From his position near the back, Professor Thompson watched with growing concern as his colleague crossed line after line. He had seen Anderson be provocative before, but this was different. This was personal. "You know what I find truly remarkable?" Anderson continued, his voice dripping with intellectual superiority. "In this room, we have some of the brightest young minds in America, future scientists, leaders, thinkers. Yet I guarantee some of you still cling to these primitive beliefs, unable to break free from your cognitive limitations." Barron sat perfectly still, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. Unlike the other students who either nervously laughed or stared at their desks, he met the professor's gaze with unwavering composure. This seemed to fuel Anderson's contempt even further. "Tell me," he challenged, removing his glasses and leaning forward on the podium, "what does it say about someone's intellectual capacity when they still believe in an invisible sky daddy in 2025, when their cognitive development is so stunted that they need fairy tales to explain the world?" His eyes locked onto Barron. "Perhaps some of our more politically connected students would care to enlighten us." The tension in the room was palpable. Students watched breathlessly as the professor's thinly veiled attack hung in the air. But none of them, not even Anderson himself, were prepared for what happened when Barron finally stood up. "Actually, Professor," Barron's voice cut through the tension, calm and measured, "I would be happy to address your concerns about cognitive development." A smirk spread across Professor Anderson's face. "Well, well. Young Mr. Trump wants to educate us about intellectual capacity," he gestured theatrically. "Please, enlighten us about how your God fits into the modern world of quantum physics and artificial intelligence." "First," Barron replied, maintaining his composure, I find it interesting that someone who champions intellectual discourse would resort to mockery instead of actual academic discussion. A few gasps echoed through the lecture hall. But since you brought up cognitive development, Anderson's smirk faltered slightly. This wasn't the fumbling response he had expected. "Oh, please," Anderson interrupted. "Spare us the Sunday school lessons. I've spent 30 years studying cognitive development. Are you suggesting you know better?" "I'm suggesting," Barron continued, his voice gaining strength, "that your bias is showing, Professor. You claim to follow the evidence, yet you ignore the countless brilliant minds throughout history and today who reconcile faith and reason. Newton, Planck, Collins, ancient history." Anderson scoffed. "Is God a magician too? Is that what you're going to tell us next?" His attempt at humor fell flat as students watched Barron's collected response. "You know what's fascinating, Professor?" Barron stood straighter. "You mock faith while displaying your own kind of religious devotion, a blind faith in your own intellectual superiority. You've created your own form of dogma, where anyone who disagrees with you must be cognitively inferior." The room fell silent. Professor Thompson leaned forward in his seat, watching his colleague's face. "Redden." Anderson had never encountered this level of articulation or this calm dismantling of his assumptions. His next words came out almost as a snarl. "Fine, Mr. Trump. You want a debate? Let's debate. Come down here and explain to us all how your medieval beliefs survive scientific scrutiny. Show us this superior intellect of yours." As Barron made his way to the front of the lecture hall, no one could have predicted how this challenge would end, least of all Professor Anderson himself. The lecture hall fell silent as Barron made his way to the front. Professor Anderson's stance was triumphant, clearly anticipating an easy victory over this young believer. But something in Barron's calm demeanor made a few students exchange worried glances. "Since you mentioned quantum physics earlier," Barron began, his voice clear and steady, "let's start there. You claim faith is incompatible with modern science, yet quantum mechanics itself has shown us that reality is far stranger than our limited human minds can comprehend." "Oh, please," Anderson interrupted. "Don't try to use quantum mechanics to justify—" "I'm not finished, Professor," Barron continued, politely but firmly. "You spoke about cognitive development. Let's discuss that. You argue that belief in God indicates lower intelligence, yet you ignore the extensive research showing that faith often correlates with higher resilience, stronger community bonds, and better mental health outcomes." Anderson's face twitched. This wasn't going according to his plan. "Correlation doesn't equal causation," Anderson muttered. "Exactly my point, Professor," Barron replied. "Yet you had no problem implying causation when it suited your argument about IQ and religious belief." A murmur of appreciation rippled through the audience. Professor Thompson watched as his colleague's confident smirk began to fade. "But let's address your real issue," Barron continued. "You're not really angry at God or religion. You're angry at what you perceive as intellectual weakness. So let me ask you this. What's more intellectually honest, admitting there might be things beyond our current understanding, or arrogantly claiming we've figured it all out?" Anderson's face reddened. "That's not—" "When you mock faith," Barron pressed on, "you're not just mocking me or my beliefs. You're mocking the billions of people throughout history who found meaning, purpose, and profound truth in their relationship with God, including, I might add, many of the scientists whose shoulders you stand on." The professor's composure was cracking. He hadn't expected this level of articulation, this calm dismantling of his assumptions. Students who had been smirking earlier were now watching Barron with growing respect. "So tell me, Professor," Barron's voice took on an edge of challenge, "what's more indicative of stunted cognitive development, believing in a higher power, or believing that mockery is a substitute for actual intellectual discourse?" The room held its breath. Professor Anderson opened his mouth to respond, But for the first time in his career, he found himself completely unprepared for what was coming next. Professor Anderson gripped the podium, his knuckles white. You're twisting things, he sputtered. Science has explained everything that religion once claimed was divine intervention. Has it? Barron's response was measured. Then perhaps you can explain consciousness, Professor, the origin of life itself, why the universe's physical constants are perfectly tuned for life to exist. Those are just gaps in our current knowledge, Anderson muttered. Exactly, Barron interjected. Gaps in our knowledge. Yet you're so certain that nothing divine could possibly exist within those gaps. Isn't that itself a form of blind faith? The audience was completely captivated now. Several students who had laughed at Anderson's earlier mockery were nodding along with Barron's points. But let's talk about your real argument, Barron continued. You suggest that faith is a crutch for the intellectually weak, yet here you are using your academic position as a crutch to bully those who disagree with you. Which one shows more intellectual insecurity? Professor Anderson's face had turned a deep shade of red. Now listen here. No. Barron's voice was firm but respectful. You claim to champion free thinking, yet you ridicule anyone who thinks freely enough to disagree with you. You preach intellectual superiority while displaying intellectual intolerance. The tension in the room was electric. Professor Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his seat, seeing his colleague's carefully cultivated authority crumbling before his eyes. So here's my question for you. Barron paused, his gaze steady. If belief in God is such a sign of intellectual weakness, why are you so threatened by it? Anderson opened and closed his mouth, but no words came out. The silence in the room was deafening. Barron prepared to deliver his final argument, one that would leave the professor wishing he'd never started this confrontation. I'll tell you why you're threatened, Professor. Barron's voice carried clearly through the silent hall. Because deep down, you know that your entire worldview rests on a fundamental contradiction. Anderson gripped the podium tighter. What contradiction? You claim to follow evidence and reason, yet you've made an absolute negative. Claim that God cannot exist, Barron continued. Any true scientist knows that proving a negative is impossible, so your certainty isn't scientific at all, it's dogmatic. The professor's face paled slightly. Students who had been taking notes were now watching transfixed. Furthermore, Barron continued. You mock people for finding meaning in faith while you've turned your own atheism into a kind of religion. You preach it with the same fervor you criticize in believers. You've simply replaced God with your own intellect. A few students nodded vigorously. Even some who had initially sided with the professor were now completely engrossed in Barron's dismantling of their teacher's arguments. But here's the most telling contradiction. Barron paused, his eyes locking with Anderson's. You claim that believing in God is a sign of lower intelligence, yet you're unable to counter even basic theological arguments from a student. So which is it, Professor? Are believers intellectually inferior, or are you just intellectually unprepared? The silence was absolute. Professor Anderson's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. His entire academic career had been built on intimidating students, with his intellectual superiority, but now, and here's the question that I think will really demonstrate the flaw in your thinking, Barron said, his voice calm but powerful. You argue that faith in God is irrational, yet you have faith that consciousness arose from unconscious matter, that life emerged from non-life, that order came from chaos, all without any divine guidance. So, tell me, Professor, which requires more blind faith? Believing in a divine creator, or believing that nothing created everything? The look on Professor Anderson's face made it clear he had no answer. And that's when he knew he had made a terrible mistake in challenging Barron Trump's faith. The silence in the lecture hall was deafening. Professor Anderson stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, clearly searching for a response that wouldn't come. Students leaned forward in their seats, waiting for his rebuttal to Barron's devastating logic. Well, that's... Anderson stammered, his academic prowess crumbling before everyone's eyes. His hands trembled slightly against the podium. "The fact is, Professor," Barron continued, his voice still respectful but firm, "your bias against faith isn't based on reason or evidence. It's based on prejudice. And prejudice, as you often teach, is the enemy of true intellectual discourse." That's when Professor Thompson chose to intervene. "Perhaps we should return to our scheduled program," he called out, rising from his seat. "We have a lot of material to cover today." Barron, recognizing the mercy being offered to the humiliated professor, nodded graciously. "Thank you for allowing me to share my perspective, Professor Anderson," he said, turning, to return to his seat. The young Trump's dignified exit only highlighted Anderson's earlier rudeness. The professor stood at his podium, visibly shaken, watching as Barron walked back to his desk. The other students' eyes followed him with newfound respect. Professor Anderson attempted to continue his lecture, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. His hands shook as he shuffled his papers, and his eyes kept darting to where Barron sat, as if expecting another intellectual assault at any moment. For the next 30 minutes, Professor Anderson attempted to continue his lecture, but the damage was done. His voice, usually so confident and commanding, now wavered with uncertainty. Every assertion he made seemed to echo with his earlier humiliation. Students who had once hung on his every word were now stealing glances at Barron, their expressions a mixture of awe and respect. A few were quietly taking notes, but not about the lecture. They were recording what they had just witnessed, the modern approach to cognitive development, Anderson's VU. Voice trailed off as he caught sight of Barron taking careful notes, the same composed expression on his face. The professor quickly looked away, losing his train of thought entirely. In the back of the room, Professor Thompson watched with a mix of sympathy and understanding. He had warned Anderson about his increasingly aggressive attacks on Anderson's students' beliefs, but his friend had always dismissed the concerns as soft. Now, he had learned the hard way just how costly such arrogance could be. As the class continued, the balance of power in that room had irrevocably shifted. Barron Trump had won more than just the intellectual debate. He had demonstrated, without a shred of doubt, that faith and intellect were not incompatible. And in doing so, he had left Professor Anderson's worldview and his pride in tatters. The lecture concluded with Barron receiving a round of applause, and the professor left in complete silence. The room buzzed with quiet conversations. The legend of Barron Trump had just grown a lot bigger.